In this video, I'll give you some concrete strategies for beginning your PhD program. If you're watching this video, chances are you're curious about starting a PhD, or maybe you've just started your PhD program and are excited about it. Either way, my goal here is to give you some concrete strategies to think through your first year or your first few months of your PhD program. First, let's start by congratulating you. It's a big deal to start a PhD program. A very small percentage of folks in the United States have a PhD, and most of the time, PhD programs are fully funded. So not only are you joining an elite group of folks who will, be Dr. So-and-so and really develop serious expertise in an area, you're getting paid to do it. That is both an honor and a responsibility. And these next few tips will hopefully get you thinking about how to best use the opportunity you've been given and that you've frankly earned so that you can do the best with what you've got. Up until this point, chances are your goal was to get into a PhD program. Most folks who complete a PhD are very goal-oriented, that they have this idea of where they want to be and they make plans to get there. Because one of the important things about a PhD program is momentum. So you want to have small bite-sized goals. Now, how big they are, how bite-sized they feel, is really a question for you. So find a goal that is both something that you can accomplish and make sure that the goal feels like something that was a challenge and something that you feel good about accomplishing. Small, proximal goals feel both achievable and they feel good when you complete them. Related to this idea are macro goals. These goals are distal, right? They're farther away from you. Back when you were an undergrad, maybe getting into a PhD program was a distal goal, right? It's something that you wanted to do and something that you needed to plan for, but it was a ways off. Similarly, getting a PhD is just the start of a career. Remember, a PhD is the beginning. It's the beginning of your career. So you should be thinking about it just as another stepping stone, and you should be thinking about what it is you want to accomplish with your PhD. So start thinking about it. Understand what the boundaries are of what's possible for your field. Think about your goals and have them, but understand that goals that are farther away, those distal goals, they should be a little fluid, right? You should be willing to sort of shift them depending on which opportunities are presented in front of you. So in a lot of ways, you should think about goal setting as the ones that are close to you, the ones that are proximal, those should be concrete. Those you should completely understand what you would like to accomplish. Goals that are farther away, it's okay if they feel a little fuzzy, right? If you want to be a faculty member, great. You might not know where, you might not know what type of institution, but you know that you would like to become a professor. So that is what I mean by fuzzy. You understand the boundaries of it, but it's not quite in focus yet. Another strategy that you should have when you're entering your PhD program is to manage expectations. There are at least two types of expectations that you should manage. The first type of expectation is an internal expectation. What do you expect of yourself? Internal expectations, you can think of them as your capacity to do work. What is it that you hope to accomplish? But importantly, how honest are you with yourself about what you can accomplish? One of the things that happens very often in the first year of a PhD program is burnout. And burnout happens when students take on too much. It's not that they can't do it. It's that in doing it, they redline. They work a little too hard, a little too much, and then that work becomes all-encompassing to the point of exhaustion. So when the summer comes or another break comes, it becomes harder to click back into work. So it's a question of capacity. Remember, a PhD is a marathon, not a sprint. So when I say manage expectations, understand what your capacity is for work. How often can you write? Think about the time that it takes to do a task. Understand what your capacity is and manage your own expectations to align with that capacity. Because otherwise you'll find that you're working a little too much, or maybe you're working a little too little. So you want to make sure that you have that alignment as best as possible, knowing that your capacity will change. You will get better at doing certain things. You will get better at doing more. But you should always be checking in with yourself. When it comes to managing expectations, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't very good at it as a graduate student. I was the type of student who often needed the pressure of a deadline, a looming deadline like tomorrow, to finish a thing. And that was a maladaptive way to be motivated because it caused me to burn out a couple of times. Frankly, it also caused me to not perform to the best of my ability a few other times. So even faculty who are successful fall prey to this idea that sometimes I just need to be pushed up against a wire, and that's what's going to get me moving forward, and that's what's going to get me writing. And many of us sort of have found ways to make that work, but it's one of the worst ways to work because it forces you to write in a panic or to work in a panic, which causes you to not be as reflective of the work that you're doing. And for me, what that meant sort of candidly is that sometimes I would write too fast and not well, and I would turn something in and just be happy that it was done instead of proud that I finished. And sometimes that stuff sort of made it to conferences and it was fine, but there was always this lingering feeling that I could have done a little bit better. So rather than sort of sit with that, what I've learned somewhat late into the game is to pace myself a little bit more so that I have time. And how much you need to pace yourself is a function of your own experience. Some people are pretty good sort of on that first draft and they don't need to do a lot of polishing. Other folks need a few more iterations to get where they need to be and they need more time to do the work. But either way, find the pace that works for you and stick to it, because this boom and bust cycle of deadline and burnout and working really hard end up being maladaptive in the long run and frankly unsustainable. This gets to the second idea about expectations, which is external expectations. Once you have a proper handle of what it is you can do, you need to also communicate those expectations outward. You need folks to know how much work is too much work, how much work can you get done in how much time, and be very clear about those expectations to your advisor, to other faculty. When you're in class, you might not have a lot of flexibility, but really you're in class for only a handful of years before you go off and you're expected to manage your own time and deliver. So what that means is that you need to communicate those expectations externally. Give folks a sense of how long something will take you. If you say that, writing a literature review is only going to take you a couple of days, one of two things is happening. Either you're lying to yourself or it actually will only take you a couple of days. Either way, you should make sure that you're accurate when you're communicating that externally. For example, when I was in graduate school, I could hypothetically write a conference paper in 3 or 4 days, right? It's something that I could hypothetically do, but what that meant was working 12, 13-hour days to get it done. No one sees that work but me. My advisor didn't see it, other faculty didn't see it, they just saw the product. So if I were mismanaging my expectations, then what would happen is they would expect that level of productivity, but what that would mean is burnout for me. So you have to make sure that you understand that your internal capacity and those expectations that go along with that capacity need to be communicated outwardly. Otherwise, there can be misunderstandings, and those misunderstandings can lead to missed opportunities. You've heard me say this before, but building relationships is important. Build a fruitful relationship with your advisor. That doesn't mean that you need to pal around with them. That doesn't mean that they need to be your friend. What that means is that you need to have a working relationship that's productive and professional. It can often steer toward friendship or toward sort of collegiality, but that doesn't mean that's what the expectation should be. Instead, think about the relationship you're building with your advisor as a colleague that you will eventually hope to emulate, potentially, right? Maybe their work style is a little different than yours, which is fine. But the idea here is to manage the relationship and make sure it's largely positive. Now, if you have an advisor that isn't as supportive, there are other strategies that are worth looking into, and I'm sure I'll get into those in a different video. But for now, as a first-year PhD student, really think about your advisor as a resource and someone that's there to help you. You should also think about your peers, other people who started the program when you started it, as an additional resource. This isn't to commodify them and to only see people as resources, but I mean that in as a all-encompassing and friendly way as I can, right? People in your life help you. So think of your peers as a community that you're helping to foster and build so that you can help each other. Sometimes that help is social, right? Someone you grab a drink with or coffee with and bitch about your advisor to. Or maybe you're just complaining about class, right? It's that venting that you might need, which is perfectly normal, and you should do it if you need to. But think about your peers as folks that will be in your life potentially for a long time. Build those relationships so that you can just become acculturated to the environment of academia, and so that you understand that everyone approaches their work differently, and it'll really help center you as a first-year PhD student, because you'll see where you can go, and you'll see how paths diverge and how there are different ways to be successful. You should also consider other faculty as folks you can build relationships with, not just faculty you take classes with either. Often it's important to have these faculty as allies or as sounding boards for your ideas, or sometimes just as someone to approach when something's not going quite right in your program. And be proactive. One of the things that's important to know as a first-year PhD student is that the farther along you go in this career, the busier you get. So be persistent, but also understand that sometimes there isn't the perfect advisor. There's simply your advisor and then what you learn from other people. So you end up cobbling together sort of this Frankenstein advisor that ends up being useful because they end up telling you things as a collective, right? It's kind of like the Borg in Star Trek, where it's not just one person, it's a collective. So build your Borg, or build your collective, I guess is what I'm saying. Because then you'll find that it ends up being much more fruitful than really putting all your eggs in one basket. One thing that you should avoid in this notion of relationship building is comparison. Think of comparison as something that isn't useful if it feels negative. Lots of folks around you will be doing just as well as you, or better than you, or maybe a little worse than you. But don't compare yourself to anyone. Compare yourself to your previous self. How have you grown? What have you learned? Because often in this highly competitive environment, you'll feel like you need to do as much or more than the people around you. And that's not quite right. You're all specialists. So do more of what you should be doing, right? Find your specialty and do more of that. But don't feel like you need to count, because often you'll find that it ends up robbing you of the motivation to move forward. As a new PhD student, you should map your resources. Think of resources both as hard currency, who funds me and where can I get money to travel to conferences, etc. But it also means softer things. Who knows what? And who can I approach when I need to learn something specific? Your advisor is a resource. Yes, they're a person, but they also know a bunch of things that you don't, and you should feel confident and comfortable asking them questions. Your peers are also resources. Your institution is a resource. So think of all of the different resources that the university has to offer and think creatively, because one of the most important things you can do as a graduate student is to understand the resources that are available to you, because then you'll be able to access certain pots of money or certain types of expertise via workshops that you might not have thought about. Related to this is this idea that you should ask for help when you need it. Often, one of the things that happens, especially if you're feeling like an imposter, is this idea that you should know everything and you shouldn't ask for help. This is not something you should do. You should always ask for help. Don't think that asking for help is weakness, because frankly, no one cares that much about your own perception of yourself in that way. If someone asks me for help and I can help them, I do. I don't think about what it means for them. I just know that I can be helpful. And you'll find that most folks in the academy are like that. It's important for you to ask for help when you need it. One of the things that ends up being very detrimental to first-year PhD students is this idea that they have to do everything for themselves, that they have to write the perfect paper, that they have to do the perfect research project without asking for help. A lot of times this comes from a highly competitive environment that happened in undergraduate studies, where you felt like you had to shine more than everyone else to become competitive for a PhD program. But once you're in one, ask for help. Ask your peers for help, ask your advisor for help, because frankly, if you don't ask for help, you're not going to grow nearly as much as you would if you did ask for help. Take your ego and put it aside for a second and just ask for help, because through the act of asking, you'll learn a lot. And more importantly, folks will also get to know you a little bit more. When you hit a challenging spot, ask around. How did people solve that challenge? Because that'll help center you. And it's important to feel centered as your first year PhD student, because if you're not centered, you're likely to do unproductive things. The final thing that you should keep in mind as a first year PhD student is that you shouldn't make excuses. Now, this might come off as me scolding you a little bit, even though you didn't do anything wrong. I'm not scolding you, unless you're making an excuse, in which case I might be scolding you. Often when we fail And you will fail at a PhD. That's the idea. You'll do something really hard. It's not going to go as well as you think it will. And one of two things will happen. You'll learn from it, or you'll move forward, or you won't win this fight against making an excuse. You'll make an excuse for why something's not working, or for why you didn't do something you were supposed to on time. And this does a couple of things that aren't helpful. One is it sort of begins to taint your reputation as someone who is, rather than trying to solve the problem, wants to save face and make an excuse. Don't be that person. Instead, find ways to productively move forward. Productive failure isn't something that just happens. It's a mindset, and it's necessary for you to fail, to own it, and then to move forward. And what that means for you and your program is likely very specific to you and your program, but you should still be comfortable with this notion of failing and owning it, as opposed to failing and making an excuse about it.